Okay, in this lecture we are going to start the third part of our course, which is mainly related to the global value chains. In this lecture we will deal with some conceptual aspects of the global value chains that are introduced by Paul Antras in his paper that is forthcoming in the World Bank Economic Review. The main objective of the lecture is to give an overview of the basic key conceptual aspects related to the rise of the global value chains. And in this paper, Paul Antras mainly introduces three types of concepts: the broad concept, the narrow concept, and the relational concept. The broad concept is mainly related to the country industry level. The narrow concept is mainly related to the firm level, and the relational concept is mainly related to the actors or the major actors in the global value chains, like the firms, the producers, the traders, the suppliers. Okay, and the main objective of introducing the relational aspect is to highlight the importance of the institutional factors in setting the locations of the global value chains. Hence, also the main objective is not only to highlight the series of alternative interpretations, but also the main implication of these different interpretations. The implication in terms of what? In terms of how we can measure the rise of the global value chains, what are the main key determinants, and what are the implications for the global value chain participation, either at the country level or at the firm level or at the relational level. And when we talk about the implications of the global value chains, we will talk about its impact on income gains, economic growth, in the environment, and so on. At the end of the paper, also he will provide some thoughts regarding the future of the global value chain by examining how the rise of the automation and the digital technologies like the 3D printing, for example, will affect the future of global value chains. Hence, in order to start, we know that several factors have played a great role in driving the globalization of production processes across countries, such as the ICT revolution, the reduction in trade barriers or either the tariff or non-tariff barriers, or even the political developments that are highlighted by the great expansion of the capitalist system and the greater share of the world population that participates in the expansion of this system. What are the main implications of what we call the globalization of the production processes is that more firms nowadays are organizing their production on a global scale, which means that they always seek to offshore either parts, components, or services, or even tasks to other producers in foreign countries, even if they are distant countries. This implies also that the label that we are always familiar with, like made in China, made in USA, is disappearing, but because most of the products nowadays are made in the world. However, some say that there are a great overlap between the current system of trade globalization or trade integration, which is overlapping with the old era because it has the same aspect of the increase in trade to GDP ratio, for example. However, defining the rise of global value chain as an intensification of trade integration will not highlight the key dimensions or the main characteristics of this phenomenon. Therefore, the paper will do the following. First of all, we will present a broad conceptualization of the rise of global value chain, how can we define it at a broad level? It's defined as an increase in the extent to which the goods and services transacted across borders are intermediate inputs rather than final goods, which means that countries are increasingly using foreign value added in their production, especially if this production is destined for exports. And this foreign value added, it takes several forms, like the increase in use of the increase in using foreign materials, intermediate inputs, or tasks or services. Okay. The second thing, he will try to apply the broad definition of global value chains at the country industry level to the firm level. And the main objective of this is to highlight how can we define the GVC participation at the firm level, especially in an environment where firms have some market power, and market power implies the ability to have increasing returns to scale. Yet, at the empirical level, measuring the GVC participation is very lacking, because the literature mainly focuses on measuring the GVC at the country industry level, and mainly by using the word input-output table. However, he sees that we can apply the same measurements at the firm level, and we'll see how he will highlight this in this paper. This narrow conceptualization of GVC that will be highlighted by Paul Antras in this paper will also highlight the fact that some firms when they trade in the GVCs, therefore when firms when we try to relate between the firm level and GVC participation, Paul Antras wants to say that firms are able to exchange highly customized inputs on a repeated basis, which means that we are not only talking at the country industry level, but at the firm level. So how do firms act in a highly globalized GVC? They will try to exchange highly customized inputs on repeated basis, which means that some firms, in order to produce a certain product, they will seek to use a specific type of input, and this specific type of input should be obtained from a specific producer. Okay, and since we are seeking for a highly customized input and from a specific producer, this implies that contracts plays an important role in governing the relationships within the GVCs. So what would be the implication if a country is characterized by the lack of institutions like intellectual property rights or the inability to enforce contracts? How would this affect the GVCs? Okay. Also, firms within the GVCs, they spend a long time to design the organizational structure of the production networks, which means that we don't only look at the relationship between a country or between an industry, but also between firms within the same stage of production. Therefore, the narrow conceptualization will allow us to introduce different or new determinants of trade within the global value chains, because within the broad conceptualization we will define GVCs as only another form of deeper trade integration across countries, and they will be shaped by the same traditional factors like the factor endowments or comparative advantages. And trade flows within the broad definition of GVCs are defined as anonymous and one-shot transactions. By contrast, in the narrow definition, trade flows are not anonymous because firms will look for specific type of suppliers. Therefore, they place they always accord very big importance to the identity of the producer. Also, transactions are not one shot because a certain good can cross several borders. Okay. Therefore, the narrow analysis will put at the center stage the major actors, the multinational firms or lead firms in GVCs. Lead firms in GVCs are defined by firms that have multiple commercial forward and backward relationships. Okay, we will also put a very big importance on the foreign direct investment and the importance of the institutional factors in shaping the location of global Also, at the end of the paper, he will put some predictions. He will predict how an increase in automation or the adoption of digital technologies will affect the landscape of the international economy, and how would this affect different agents in. So the first point in the lecture would be the broad view of the global value chains. And in order to define the global value chains at the country industry level, it's defined as a series of stages that are involved in the production of a certain product or service, with the main objective to be sold to consumers. Each stage should be adding a certain value, and each stage should be produced in at least 2 different countries. So we say that a firm is participating in a global value chain if it produces at least one stage in the global value chain. And a production is related to a global value chain if it embodies or it includes a value added that is produced from 2 different countries at least. Therefore, the global value chain is mainly related to the increasing use of foreign value added in production, especially if this production is destined for export. So we add here another condition that this production should be with the main objective of to be exported. And as we said in the introduction, the foreign value added could be either in the form of raw materials like tin or aluminium, or intermediate inputs like the car parts, or the back office services for tasks. There are several configurations of the global value chain, and mainly we can distinguish between the spider-like structure and the snake-like structures, and there is a hybrid between the 2 types of configurations. The spider-like, multiple parts and components converge to an assembly plant, which means that several parts and components are produced simultaneously, with the main objective is to assemble the product in another country. By contrast, for the snake-like structure, value is created sequentially in a series of stages. And from the following slide, we can see that for the snake, we have to follow a certain stage from 1 to 6 to reach a certain assembly. For the spider, several parts and components are produced simultaneously, and in order to reach a certain assembly and then to reach the final demand. The hybrid, it combines both configurations with the main objective to reach a certain assembly and then the final demand. Therefore, we can see that global value chain imply a higher level of fragmentation of production across borders, which implies a finer international division of labor, which means that countries are able to reap higher gains from specialization. Why? Because the resources are able to flow to the most productive use, not only at the country or industry or sector level, but also within different stages within the sectors of production. And this would magnify the growth, employment, and distributional impacts of standard trade. So under this hyper-specialization interpretation of global value chain, we can expect that the traditional determinants of international trade, like factor endowments, institutions, geography, market size, would play an important role in explaining how, to what extent countries or industries are embedded in a certain chain. However, the way they affect the flows or the trade flows in the global value chain may be different from the way they affect the traditional trade. As we said, the traditional trade flows are characterized by being anonymous, and at the same time they are one-shot transactions. And these transactions are usually defined between two countries, one exporting and another importing country. And most of the time these flows, they cross the border only one time. So by opposition to this, the global value chains entail, or it's defined by the production processes that cross borders multiple times, and they can involve more than two countries. So what would be the implication for the measurement of the rise of the global value chain activity? There are several challenges because many customs data are not accommodated to measure the rise of the global value chains, and the customs data are recognized as being the standard source for the international trade flows, and they mainly provide information on where the transacted good or service was produced and where it will flow. However, it does not provide any information on which countries were involved in the production of the good, on how it was produced, and it does not provide also information on how the good that will be transacted, how it will be used. For example, when a country I export a certain product to country G, the customs data does not define how the good will be used. It will be fully consumed, absorbed in the importing country, or it will be used by the country by adding value added to it and then re-exported. So the customs data are not truly accommodated to measure the rise of the global chains. However, several efforts have been undertaken to trace the trade flows of value added across countries, and this by combining data from custom offices with the national input-output tables. And we have three major sources for the data, mainly the World Input-Output database developed by researchers at the University of Groningen, and the OECD Trade in Value Added database, and the EORA multi-region input-output table developed by researchers at the University of Sydney. The structure of the World Input-Output table is as follows. We have a certain country, a number of countries from 1 to G, and countries are symbolized by either I or G. And we have industries from 1 to S, and they are symbolized either by R or S. So if we look at the heart of the table, the input use and value added, and we have country 1 from country 1 to country G, and we have in each country a certain number of industries from 1 to S, as well as for either horizontally or vertically. And if we look at Z or SIG, this symbolizes the purchase of a certain intermediate input by industry S in country G from the industry R in country I. So the heart of the table, it represents mainly the trade in intermediate input flows. Therefore, then if we look at the final use column, this symbolizes the final expenditures by a certain country on a certain certain product from a certain sector in country I, for example. Which means that country G will do a final use of a certain product originating from a certain industry or certain sector in country I. And these final consumption flows are symbolized by F. So FSIG, this symbolizes the final expenditure by country G on product obtained from a certain sector S in country I. And the column of total use, if we read it horizontally, this represents the total use of a certain output obtained from a certain sector in a certain country, because a certain output is used either as an intermediate product or for final consumption, and this is symbolized by YSG, and this represents mainly the gross output of a certain sector in a certain country. Okay, the following this is the two slides present the description of the word input output table, and what's the importance of using the word input output table? Mainly to elaborate some measures to define the global value chains. For example, in order to measure the extent to which a country is participating in the global value chains, we can measure the share of a country's exports that flow through at least two borders. And this graph measure the importance of global value chain in total world trade, and we find that from 1970 to 2005 there has been a significant increase in the share of the global value chains, and from with the global financial crisis it started to decline and to increase a little bit, but there's a general tendency towards a decline. However, we can say that around 50% of the world trade is related to the global value chains. So we defined the global value chain or the share of the global value chains in world trade as the share of a country's exports that flows through at least two borders. These exports mainly encompass or contain two types of global value chains trade. We have the backward and we have the forward GVC participation. The backward GVC participation means that a country's exports contains value added that was previously imported from another country. The forward GVC participation implies that a country's exports will not be fully absorbed in the importing country, but it will be embodied in the importing country's exports to a third country. So we have these exports implies that we have two types of linkages. We have the backward and the forward. When we compute these types of participation at the country industry level, we will see that the expansion of the value chain activity is very uneven across the whole world, because we have the first at the left we have low participation in limited commodities, high commodities, limited manufacturing, advanced manufacturing and services, innovative activities, and data gaps. Mainly we will see that Europe and the United States are highly active in the global value chains, while Latin America and Africa are mainly not active countries. Also, the uneven participation occurs not only at being active or not active, but also regarding the sectoral composition, which means that we see that the United States, for example, will be mainly specialized in the providing the innovative goods and services. African countries are mainly specialized in the agriculture value added chains or the limited manufacturing, and also in the provision of natural resources. And this is also the case of some Latin American countries that are specialized in the limited commodities. Okay. Also some countries in Africa like Tanzania are specialized in low tech or limited manufacturing, while China, for example, is participating in advanced manufacturing. So we have uneven participation of countries as being active or not active. Also at the sectoral level, there are great variation across what are the main limitations of the word input output tables. First of all, it's a very aggregated data, so it will be missing finer details about the participation at the firm levels. Also, some data are missing from some countries because data is not ready either from customs data or from their national input output table. So researchers are always obliged to impose some assumptions in order to move on with their own research. So regarding the main determinants of the GVCs participation, they are very similar to those shaping the traditional trade flows, like factor endowments, institutional quality, the market size, and trade costs. However, how they affect the GVC participation and the positioning of countries is very different. First of all, regarding the factor endowments, we can expect that countries that are richer in natural resources will be highly participating in what we call the forward GVC participation, because they will export the natural resources that will be embodied in the downstream production processes. And related to the concept of forward and backward GVC participation, we have the downstream and the upstream. And the downstream production processes, it involves the processing of the materials collected during the upstream stage. So we move from the upstream to the downstream. So the natural resources rich countries will be highly specialized in the experts of the natural resources, and they will mainly be specialized in the forward GVC participation or the upstream production processes. Okay, this is also caused by what? Not only the fact that they are rich in natural resources, but also by the practice of what we call the tariff escalation, which means that developed countries always impose higher tariff rates on final products than on semi-products, than on raw products. Therefore, developing countries always aim at specializing in the most upstream stages of, for example, agriculture GVCs, which means that they export raw products before they are processed. By contrast, physical or skill labor abundant countries, they will specialize mostly in some studies they say that they may specialize either in the upstream or the downstream, depending on the intensity of the upstream and downstream production processes. If the downstream production processes are more intensive in physical or skilled labor, so countries which are abundant in these factors of production will specialize in the downstream stages of production. For example, for the case of the United States, we see that the upstream sectors are highly intensive in skilled labor and capital, so they will mainly in the GVC they will feature mainly high levels of forward GVC participation rather than backward GVCs participation. By contrast, the World Development Report argued that physical capital scarce countries will specialize in upstream rather than downstream production processes. And the report that was published in 2020. And it mainly focused on the global value chains. The report argued that the relationship between factor endowments and GVC positioning is highly blurred by the importance of the FDI capital inflows. For example, for the case of Nigeria, Nigeria is a very scarce country in physical capital. However, it's highly specializing in oil extraction, and oil extraction is intensive in physical capital, and this is caused by what? By the high presence of FDI inflows, which increase the country's comparative advantage in that sector, upstream production stage. So Nigeria will be featuring high level of forward rather than backward GVC participation. So this was the first determinant of GVC participation. The second determinant is the quality of a country's institutions, the level of political stability, and the degree of contract enforcement, which means that is the country able to enforce contracts, because since GVCs are high engines of hyper specialization and it involves several stages of production, so there is a kind of complementarity between different production stages. So each stage would be very sensitive to any kind of contract frictions, and contractual frictions may cause high level of production delays, and also it will increase the occurrence of the mishaps. So the existence, or if the country is able to enforce contracts and to secure transactions within the GVCs, this country will be able to highly participate and to be active in the global value chains. And we always say that this factor in this determinant is affecting the GVC in a higher way than the traditional trade flows. It affects GVC trade disproportionately compared to the traditional trade flow. Why? Because it involves several stages of production, and these stages of production are very complementary, so they are very sensitive to any kind of institutional regarding trade costs affect traditional and GVCs, but also it affects GVCs more than traditional trade flows. Why? Because we know that we have several types of trade costs that range from geographical features to the level of infrastructure, whether it's inefficient or not, regulatory barriers, or the customs delays. How trade costs affect GVCs? Similar to traditional trade flows. For example, if we have strict custom regulations, this would result in production delays, because it will retard or it will block the arrival of the intermediate inputs. Also, the higher trade costs in general will have a compound effect on the price of the product, because it will not only affect the price of the final product, but also it will affect the cost of imported intermediate input, which moves down the value chain from the upstream to the downstream. So therefore, if trade costs increases, this will have a very depressing effect on the GVC participation. Regarding several studies have shown that regional trade agreements are effective in eliminating trade barriers, and therefore GVCs will be highly will rise intensively between the signatory countries. And however, this is not always the case. For example, it's the case for the EU, as well as for the Association of the Southeast Asian Nations, but not for the Mercosur countries. Also, trade costs affect not only the participation of countries, but also their own positioning. For example, for the snake-like GVCs, which is a sequential configuration, trade costs, we said, will compound along the value chain. So it will have a more negative effect on the downstream rather than the upstream. Hence, countries that are most remote, or they have very strict custom regulations, or they have high trade barriers, will always specialize in the upstream, while while other countries that are more centralized and they have better geographical locations and they have more flexible regulations will specialize in the downstream stages. The final determinant is the market size, and we, as in the case of the traditional trade flows, we expect that larger economies are able to export more because they have higher level of production, and to import more because they have higher level of income. However, the effect on GVC participation is not always clear, because we can see that larger countries, if we focus only on the snake like GVC configuration, large countries will be able to attract the stages of productions that are contiguous. Why? Because this will minimize the cost of transporting the semi-processed goods. We call this to minimize the cross-hauling of the semi-processed goods. So this implies that countries that are larger will specialize more in the forward GVC integration rather than the backward GVC integration. Another point of view is that large countries are geographically closer to the final demand, and therefore they have a central location and they will be able to specialize more in the downstream GVC integration. So the effect of the market size on GVC participation, on whether the country will be more for the backward or the forward, is not clear cut. Regarding the consequences of the GVC participation, we will examine the impact of GVC participation on the level of income or income growth, the income distribution, on the environment, on the industrialization, and on poverty. First, we see that similar to the case of the traditional trade flows, the GVC will allow a final level of international division of labor. Therefore, we expect that the GVC will be associated with higher or greater income gains from trade. Why? Because countries are more able to benefit from the comparative advantage of other countries, not only at the sectoral level, but also within different stages of production within different sectors. Also at the firm level, when a firm is able to import low-cost inputs, to import inputs at lower cost, this will allow an expansion of the firm's scale and to increase its own productivity, and this will be reflected in real income gains at the level. Also, we expect that the effect on income gains will be magnified by the intensity of technological diffusion if GVC is associated with higher technology diffusion. Also, GVCs are expected to generate an important modification in income distribution like the traditional trade flows. So the Stolper-Samuelson theory, when it was applied to the traditional trade flows, it indicated that deeper trade integration will result in increased wage inequality in advanced countries that are more skilled labor abundant, while it will decrease wage inequality in less developed countries that are skilled labor scarce countries. However, when we apply this theory to the GVC word of fragmentation, it's not really applicable for three reasons. Because which means that we see that the increased GVC participation will increase wage inequality in both advanced and less developed countries, and this is for three reasons. First of all, when production is offshore to less developed countries, this will increase demand for the skilled labors, and which are relatively scarce, but they will be employed in the new production processes and tasks, and this will put upward pressure on wage inequality. Also, we see that the GVCs are more skill sensitive, and this is mainly due to, first, the fact that they produce goods that are destined to quality sensitive consumers in rich countries. Also, Second, they are characterized by high complementarity between the various stages of productions that are carried in different countries. Therefore, this implies that when we offshore more stages to developing countries are obliged to adopt biased policies in favor of the skilled labor at the expense of less skilled agents, so wage inequality will increase. And finally, GVCs are characterized by being capital intensive. Production characterized by using intensively capital. So there's complementarity between capital intensity and skill intensity. So physical capital deepening will oblige countries to upgrade their own production processes by increasing the relative demand for skilled workers. Regarding the impact on poverty, we have two contradicting point of view. The first one is that the quality sensitivity of global value chains will lead to marginalizing the least skilled agents, and that the more skilled ones will have better opportunities and their own livelihood will improve at the expense of the least skilled ones, for example by bidding up the price of housing or other services. However, there's another point of view that GVC participation will have a positive impact on poverty through the trickle-down effect, because when the most skilled ones will experience higher income gains, they can spend their income on the goods and services produced by low-skilled agents. Also, it will support the development of a deeper welfare state by generalizing the benefits of higher income at the country level. Also, the GVC integration in certain regions of a country will incentivize the internal migration, which is considered as a powerful mechanism to. Also, we say that the GVCs may facilitate industrialization even if the less developed countries doesn't have the required capabilities to produce and to export industrial goods. Why? Because they will specialize in one stage of the production process, and this stage is characterized by being the low value added segment of production. However, these countries may always have a little scope of upgrading, and by upgrading they can industrialize step by step. However, due to the tariff escalation practiced by developed countries, developing countries tend always to be specializing in the most upstream stage of production and the low value added segment of production. Regarding the implication for industrialization, we say that GVC may facilitate industrialization, but the returns may not be as high as expected. And this example is the case where a car assembler in a small, less developed country can use fixed foreign input at the cost of $7,000, and the fixed sale price will be $9,000 in rich countries. The less developed country will capture a value added of $2,000 per car. However, if the rich country will decide to increase or to impose a tariff of 20%, in this case, since the fixed sale sale price is fixed at $9,000, the car assembler in the less developed country will be obliged to reduce its price to $7,500 in order to maintain the fixed sale price. So its value added will be reduced to $500, and this is due to the tariff escalation practiced by the developed country. Regarding the impact on the environment, similar to the case of traditional trade, it's expected that the GVCs will have a detrimental impact on the environment. However, since we already said that trade flows will cross borders multiple times before reaching the final consumer, so the impact on CO2 emissions will be amplified. Also, since GVC foster hyper specialization, we expect also that the pollution haven hypothesis will be applicable. The pollution haven hypothesis is the case where developed or large industrialized nations will decide to relocate the dirty production stages in countries where the environmental regulations are less stringent to avoid the cost of regulations. However, we also may expect that the negative impact on environmental performance will be alleviated due to two things. First of all, the GVCs are effective vehicle of clean technology transfer. Also, the GVCs will increase income gains, and therefore, since environmental quality is considered as a normal good, we expect that the demand on a better environmental quality will increase. Therefore, countries will be able to improve their own environmental quality. So by this we have ended the first part of the broad conceptualization of the global value chain. Then we will move to the other two concepts, the narrow and the relational concept of the global value chain.